Welcome to the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to our viewers. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division. I will be putting two rounds of questions to our very distinguished panel today, after which I will be taking questions from you, the viewers. Please send your questions to dialogues@wto.org. I'd like to begin by providing some context for today's webinar entitled Food Trade Policy, the G20 and COVID-19. As you, the viewers who've been following these dialogues since the beginning may know, we launched the Trade Dialogues on Food right at the height of the pandemic. And our goal was initially to examine the impact of COVID-19 on food trade, and in particular to raise awareness of the need to prevent a health crisis from becoming a food crisis too. The impact of COVID-19 on all trade, including certain foods, in particular the perishables, fish, at the beginning of the pandemic was dramatic. And this was due to the sudden closure of airports, of ports, social distancing requirements, and the severe restrictions on the movement of people, including farm labor. The WTO was quick to warn against increased protectionism. And so were global policymakers, in particular the G20, under the very able chairmanship of Saudi Arabia. And we're very glad to have Saudi Arabia with us on this webinar. In fact, a tremendous concern at the beginning of the pandemic was that the world would see a wave of food export restrictions in the same way that we had seen them after the 2008 food price crisis. There was also concern for the survival of global agricultural value chains, as some companies said they would reassess supply chains that were vulnerable to unexpected shocks. I think today we can safely say that some of the worst case scenarios have been avoided, even if we're not out of the woods yet. In fact, global trade appears to be rebounding much more quickly than it did after the 2008 financial crisis. It seems to be defying predictions that the pandemic could send globalization into permanent retreat. While trade remains below pre-pandemic levels, it appears to be snapping back robustly. Now, clearly the recovery isn't being felt everywhere, and trade still faces fierce headwinds, including from a possible coronavirus resurgence this fall. But we're nevertheless in a better place than we had expected to be. What we would like to do in today's webinar, therefore, is to explore the current state of play of food markets. Let me, without further ado, introduce our panel to you. Alan Wolf, the Deputy Director General of the WTO. Saad Abdullah Khalil Isa, Economic Advisor of the Ministry of Environment, Water and Agriculture of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Randall Giroux, Chairman of the Grain and Feed Trade Association Global Trade Policy Committee, as well as Vice President and Global Regulatory Leader at Cargill. Maximo Torrero, Chief Economist and Assistant Director General of the Economic and Social Development Department of the FAO, and Edwini Kessie, Director of the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division. Alan, let me hand over to you for your opening remarks.
Doa, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to provide opening remarks for this, the first episode of the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food taking place after the summer break. This episode is an opportunity for us to take stock of the global trade food market situation and of the obstacles.
You're muted, sir.
I should not be. Can you hear me?
Yes.
COVID-19 has been a cause of serious concern for more than one reason. It threatened to become not only a health and economic crisis, but some thought that it might become a food crisis too. It did not, because the WTO, the FAO, and others made it clear that the global supply of cereals was robust, and along with the G20 called for both transparency and restraint in imposing export restrictions. International organizations cannot control individual member decisions, but they can make sure that national policymakers have full information on which to make their decisions. The WTO Agreement on Agriculture is the only existing global accord that governs worldwide agricultural trade. Given that international trade feeds 1 in every 6 people around the globe, we must continually monitor the implementation of this agreement, the agricultural agreement, and seek to improve upon its disciplines so as to ensure robust growth of trade in food and other agricultural products. Last week, the WTO held a meeting of its Committee on Agriculture, the body that oversees the implementation of the Agriculture Agreement. Seeing the Committee on Agriculture in action is always extraordinary. The WTO's 164 members grill each other on all sorts of policies, old and new, with an impact on agricultural trade. Hundreds of probing questions are posed, with agricultural attachés spending hours giving their responses. This is an international exercise in accountability and a fine example of how to manage globalization and to ensure that it remains in the interests of all. Many of the questions posed last week were directly related to COVID-19. For example, some of the questions centered on the new border measures enacted by countries to prevent the spread of COVID-19, such as new testing and packaging requirements for imported foods. Those posing questions wanted to better understand the justification for those measures. Other questions had to do with new types of subsidies for farmers or state aid programs that have proliferated in the wake of COVID-19, or the transportation subsidies that have kicked in to reduce the cost of food exports during the pandemic. Members wanted certainty that the assistance would be temporary and non-trade distorting. But there were hundreds upon hundreds of non-COVID related questions too, such as about the UK's new border controls that might exist on food during the Brexit transition, or questions on recently concluded bilateral or regional trade agreements and their consequences for those who are not signatories. The meeting was incredibly rich in content, which demonstrates not only the WTO as an administrator of trade agreements, but the WTO is a place for a full exchange of both views and hard information necessary for decision-making in capitals. Also last week, there was a negotiating session on agriculture. It's called a meeting of the Committee on Agriculture and Special Session. These discussions, separate committee from the Committee on Agriculture, these discussions have been ongoing for a number of years with a view to enhancing transparency and predictability, as well as providing a level playing field through new disciplines for international trade and agriculture. It is imperative that progress be made in these negotiations so as to ensure the continued relevance of the agriculture agreement to food and agricultural trade. While COVID-19's worst case scenarios for food trade did not happen, ultimately, what we need is a more robust WTO agricultural rulebook, one that can better ensure that markets remain open, in particular in challenging times. This means making serious and permanent reductions in agricultural tariffs, reducing trade distorting domestic support, and better regulating food export restrictions. COVID-19 was a wake-up call. We cannot allow our global food supply to become unpredictable in times of crisis. We must bulletproof the WTO Agreement on Agriculture so that we do not have to worry again. I very much look forward to hearing the views that will be expressed in this webinar. I think it is a fine thing that you are all willing to join and provide your insights to the public and to each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, and I realize you have to leave us now. I think these opening remarks were extremely useful. First, they show the extent of the monitoring that's being done by the WTO and all of the concerns that have been raised in relation to COVID, as well as to many other issues, but in particular in relation to COVID, and the negotiating track in the WTO that is trying to strengthen the existing agreement on agriculture. Let me now move to our panel for the first round of questions. Maximo, I'd like to start with you. What is the current state of play of food markets relative to the outset of the COVID-19 crisis? Where are we today?
Thank you very much, Dana, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me start to give some key indicators, which I think are important. As Alan mentioned, markets need to know the information of what is happening so that we can count markets when they need to be counted. So in terms of production, we are heading towards another record. It's 2,765 million tons, up, this is in cereals, up 58 million tons year to year with respect to previous year. Maize and rice outputs are forecast to reach new records, but a small reduction decline is expected for wheat, which is largely because of reductions in the European Union. In terms of utilization, it is forecasted 2,746 million tons, so up 2.4%, which means that there is a residual which will go to storage. And that's very important because it's not only the good harvest for 2020-21, but also having the stocks. And the stocks by the close of 2021 season are projected to increase by 1.7%. That means 195.5 million tons to an all-time high. That means that we have sufficient stocks. Now, where we need to be looking at carefully things. First, most of the increase in the stocks comes from China. And the rest of the world has increased in the stocks, but the majority is from China. So we are a little bit vulnerable to whatever is the policy of China in terms of accumulation of stocks. The second element where we need to look at carefully is that the stocks that they used to have in pork has been depleted by now. And that's why we are seeing an increase in the demand of pork, and that of course put pressure in soybeans and other feedstocks, which we are observing some small increase in prices. The third element where we need to look at, which is related to trade, which is really important, is the issue that although, as it was mentioned, we were able to count markets at the beginning of the COVID-19 and reduce the 22 countries that were already putting some export restrictions, today we are close to zero, basically affecting none of the value of food move across borders. But there is one little problem still, which is the mobility and swaps of vessels. So vessels are moving, but crews are not able to change in all the countries of the world. Major problems are still in Argentina, in Peru, and Colombia, and also in North Africa, which is a net food importing country. So that's something to look at carefully. Is another risk that we need to look at and keep tracking, and we are tracking real time this issue, because it basically means that countries have to put food health measures in the ports to allow these crews to change, because crews cannot be more than 6 to 9 months in the sea, and that's what we are trying to avoid. That happens. So they should release those constraints. Now, the other important thing is prices. And the FAO food price index is at 96 points in August, which is still down 30% from its February of 2011 peak, although we have seen an increase. But it's important to mention that that increase is not the same as the peak times. So, for example, in August 20, in the whole index is 96. The peak in February 2011 was 138, so it's 30% less. The case of cereals, in August 20, we were at 99. The peak was in 2008, in June 2008 at 160. So there is a 38% decline. In oils, 99 today, 175 in 2011, 44% below, and so on. So in all the commodities, we are not at the highest peak, so we are significantly lower than that, which means that prices are doing okay. Our expectations of what will be happening and where we need to put emphasis in the future is on high value commodities. Why? Because there will be a recession, and we are already starting to face a recession. The GDP decline of the world is supposed to be minus 4.8. Although we are starting to see recovery, as it was mentioned before, still the recovery is not what should have been. So it's not a V like we expected initially. It's a U shape, and the base of the U is prolongating. Now, what this means there will be a reduction in the demand of high-value commodities in the key exporting countries, and that's something that we need to look carefully, because that could increase food losses, especially in left in the field, as a result of that. And let me just finish in two other elements. One is the development of prices of the oilseed sector, and also the development of prices of inputs, which is linked to oil prices, which are still low. And because of the recession, that will continue to be low. And that affects not only the prices of fertilizers, which will be cheaper, which is good for producers, but also affects the capacity of countries of being able to import goods. But at the same time, we need to understand that there was one source of demand of cereals, which was biofuels. And if oil prices are so low, biofuels are not competitive, and therefore we won't have that demand of biofuels. And that's something that we need to look at carefully. So the situation is, of those elements, we are very comfortable in terms of food availability. The problem is of demand, is food access. And that's where we are really concerned, both in high value and staple commodities. The capacity of individuals to be able to consume in a world which already we have 690 million people undernourished, with a potential increase on 132 more million people undernourished because of COVID-19, which means that the access of food will be the major concern, where we need to put our major efforts in the future. Thank you.
Maximo, this was a great overview, comforting in some ways that food supply is not a problem, but worrying in others because demand is low, and the question is whether there will be food losses, as you've just mentioned. Let me move to you, Rando. Can you talk to us about grain and feed this year, how they have fared in the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we're seeing today?
Yes, so thanks first for the opportunity to participate in this event. It's a pleasure to be surrounded by so many distinguished experts and to have a virtual seat at the table here to share some perspectives. So today I represent GAFTA, which is the International Grain and Feed Trade Association. It represents approximately 1,900 members, agricultural companies, working in about 98 countries. And today we think GAFTA grain and feed move, about 80% of that moves on GAFTA contracts. So it's been 8 months, amazingly, since the start of the pandemic, and we remain optimistic and very encouraged to see how resilient and adaptable that the global food system has been, and how effectively we've been able to navigate this shock to the system. I'd like to also echo my thanks to the WTO and the G20 leadership, who have helped reinforce the importance of open markets and the need to keep trade flowing during this period of time. And I do appreciate and echo the comments of the previous speaker. From the food and grains perspective, supply and demand has remained relatively stable. We've seen that reflected in the base commodities. And while we did see a dip in demand earlier, overall the demand for grains and feed products are up, particularly thanks to the economic recovery in China, and more specifically the return of the hog sector in that part of the world. Currently, we see double-digit growth for feed in China. We did also see a significant impact on biofuels demand and pricing, as a vast majority of folks stayed home, cars sat in driveways, and people sheltered in place. This put a significant dent in the petroleum markets, and we saw those secondary effects in the prices and demands for the grains and oilseeds used in biofuels, and it was particularly acute in some of the regions. Looking forward, we do see demand for grains and feed. In fact, today we see stronger demand than we've seen 2 years ago. Much of that demand we anticipate will come from Asia as countries get back on their feet post-COVID-19. I echo that these things will move slowly, but we do see an upward trend in demand. I think it's also important to highlight that much of the positive news that I'm sharing here today around grains and feed reflect the fact that governments did act quickly to limit restrictions on essential goods, to name food as an essential, and allow it to move freely across borders. While we did see some protectionist measures emerge, overall markets have been able to work. I also want to comment that we have shown that we are much better prepared than we had been for some of the early crises, as mentioned in 2007 and 8, in 2010, which were much more disruptive and created food shortages and price spikes in a number of places in the world. And I want to both encourage and thank WTO members to continue to work on those trade policy solutions that improve the WTO rules and create an open trading environment for both food and feed. Institutions like the WTO are critical for agriculture, and agriculture has benefited immensely from the lowering of these barriers, both globally and in the creation of rules that guide those policies. And so we do think we have a very positive message to share about the industry and about demand for feed and grains going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Randall. That's another very comforting message to hear. I would now like to move over to Saad. Saad, the G20 under Saudi Arabia's chairmanship this year has played what some have called a historic role in calming international markets and keeping them open. In the area of agriculture, what has it been able to achieve exactly, and what were the stumbling blocks? Can you walk our viewers through these issues?
Good afternoon, everyone. From Riyadh, the capital of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the presidency of G20 2020. Thank you, Dua, and we thank the official in the WTO for conducting this meeting in the difficult time of the global pandemic, COVID-19. Just in brief for the respected audience, the G20 representing around 60% of the world agricultural land area and accounting also for about 80% of the world trade in agricultural products in value. Dua, if you allow me, let me just elaborate. Before COVID-19, the G20 plan, and really we worked on it, and the communique was almost ready. And the main objectives really to promote responsible agricultural investment, to reduce food losses and waste, and rural development area. The main objective is just how to increase production to 60% to meet the high demand on food by 2050, resulted almost in 10 billion people. This is before COVID-19. And the communique was almost on the last version. But after the spread of COVID-19 as global pandemic, there were really just two extraordinary meetings. The first one was in March by the leaders of the G20, and the second one was last month in April, meeting by the ministers of agriculture. In brief, our leaders really committed, all of them, to inject $5 trillion US dollars in the global economy in that meeting. And they asked really the related ministers of trade, agriculture, and also finance to follow up what's going on after, let me say, post of COVID-19, and to take the essential measures to keep the markets open, predictable, and transparent. For food security and agriculture in general, we are talking about output and inputs. We did not really realize any, let me say, lack of inputs, or let me say any trade barriers, because really the leaders in the G20 committed really to avoid any trade barriers on borders, committed not to put any, let me say, barriers in the local markets to prevent entering of inputs. And in the meantime, they requested really specifically the exporting countries not to put any measures to restrict exports to go to the demand countries. Now, I think really facing this pandemic, from our point of view, from the G20 leaders and ministers, and from our partners, really, the international organizations who worked with us from day one, I think we succeeded really to prevent any, let me say, negative impact on the global economy in agriculture, product, and sustainable food security globally.
Thank you very much, Saad. Very interesting to hear how indeed, as you said, it was one world before COVID with the different set of priorities for the G20, and then a different world when COVID hit in with the March and April meetings of G20 ministers. And indeed, you're right, the G20 played a historic role in asking leaders to keep markets open, predictable, and transparent, as you said. Edwini, let me turn over to you. Economic and trade protectionism was a major concern at the outset of this crisis. Would you say that protectionist concerns have settled?
Thank you, Doha, for this question. Indeed, there was heightened concern that the COVID-19 crisis and its resultant lockdowns would be exacerbated by trade protectionism in the food area. And there was much concern about an artificial shortage in global food supply being created. In focus was the issue of agriculture and food export restrictions, in particular, since the world had vivid memories of the events in 2008. Back then, when the financial crisis hit, the world saw a cascade of food export restrictions. The use of food for biofuels had amplified the concern that there could be an impending shortage, with one country's export restrictions leading to another. In the end, every country was worse off. During the COVID-19 crisis, the same psychology set in, a fear that the global health crisis of this magnitude would in some ways impact food gathered pace. There was the concern that the crisis would impact the international community's continued ability to share food with those in need. Gradually, we started to learn more about what was really happening to food markets during the pandemic, and fears began to subside. There was asymmetry of information, and once that was to some extent corrected, countries became apprised of the real situation. This, in addition to what we have already heard just now from colleagues about global policymakers keeping in mind the lessons from 2008 and displaying the determination to keep international markets open. In this pandemic, we gradually learned the following. One, there was no problem with global food supply. I think the FAO and others did a great job in making that very clear, AMIS and others. Wheat, corn, maize, and rice had all seen a great harvesting season. However, there was a problem in the mobility of food due to the sudden closure of airports, ports, and the broader economic lockdowns. What we were witnessing was a logistical disruption to international trade. Two, there was the risk that the logistical disruption could have turned into a food supply crisis if farm laborers were not available to work on farms due to travel restrictions and quarantine measures. It became very clear that the crisis was impacting food staples such as wheat, rice, corn, maize differently than fresh fruits, vegetables, beef, pork, chicken, fish, and live animals. The former, which are capital intensive, suffered less than the agricultural commodities that are more labor intensive. The labor-intensive crops and live animals were reduced by labor mobility and the shortage of migrant labor. Labor-intensive high-value commodities such as fresh fruits and vegetables were also more sensitive to logistical problems because of their perishable nature. However, gradually, most countries came round to recognizing agriculture as an essential economic activity and developed health codes for farm laborers. So much of the potential food supply shock was then alleviated. 3, whereas much was made of the food demand shock because of the closure of restaurants, hotels, and bars, we have seen international trade in agriculture and food to be more resilient than trade in other sectors. This is because food consumption is relatively inelastic and cannot be delayed or postponed for an indeterminate future. People cannot live without food. As a result of all this knowledge, the food export restrictions we saw at the outset of the crisis began to ease. It was also clear that the world had learned clear lessons from 2008. Countries didn't want to waste the crisis and implemented the lessons learned. Whereas export restrictions impacted about 30% of trade in 2008, they only impacted only on 6% of trade today. This does not mean that this issue shouldn't be addressed, but it does mean that we are doing much better in relative terms. It is important to note that these restrictions were not the only concern. Several other potentially trade distorting measures have been introduced in the wake of the COVID crisis. We are seeing many subsidy packages being deployed to support farmers hit by the pandemic. We have also seen many new border measures deployed, such as import restrictions, new licensing or packaging requirements. It will be key that these measures, as many WTO members have underlined, be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. Finally, let me say that we have also seen trade liberalizing measures in the wake of the pandemic. For example, some countries have made unilateral tariff reductions to bring down the cost of food and make food accessible to the poorer sections of their societies. Others seem to be using COVID as an opportunity to spring to the digital era, introducing all sorts of simpler and more efficient digital customs clearance procedures. In fact, according to Global Trade Alert, of the nearly 200 trade policy changes documented in the food area since COVID, only 19 involved some form of restriction on food trade. The remainder involved liberalization of food trade. So in short, the results have been mixed, but the worst case protectionist scenarios have been avoided. So that gives cause for optimism. So I think I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much, Edwini. This brings us to the end of our first round of questions, from which I draw a number of different conclusions. I mean, we're certainly in a better place than we expected. Food supply seems to be fine for the time being. Trade restrictions are easing, and the logistical disruption that we spoke about in the beginning of COVID also seems to be easing, judging by Randall's comments. However, the FAO has pointed to food demand being a concern. Both the FAO and GAFTA have spoken about biofuels, demand for biofuels still suffering. And Edwini, I think you've hinted at the fact that while trade restrictions are easing, we're not entirely out of the woods yet. So let me now come to our second round of questions. We've gone through the current state of play of things. What I would like to turn to now are your concerns regarding the future. Maximo, I'll start with you. What would you caution against in food markets going forward? What should global policymakers be attentive to?
Thank you. So first of all, I think it's important to understand that agriculture is moving into a world which is under uncertainty. What COVID-19 has shown to us that is not only we have to respond to the population growth and therefore to the more demand of food, to the climate issues, not only to that we are using intensively our natural resources, but also that there is the surprise factor. And the surprise factor is becoming every time more important. What this means is that our sector has to become more resilient to those type of shocks. And we are not used of an agriculture to operate under uncertainty. although farmers have to manage climate risk and so on and so forth. But these shocks, this component of shocks that we were never expecting, farmers knew that climate can change and they can cope with that. They have learned how to cope. But this new type of shocks that come from nowhere is something that we were not using in agriculture. So we need to work in a different way, think in a different way, and increase resilience. One element of resilience is trade. I think trade is central for us to be resilient. And as it has been mentioned, it is good news that we have been able to be in a situation where trade restrictions and trade barriers have been lowered. 22 countries, as I mentioned initially, now we are close to zero. In 2007, 2008, we had 33 countries, which meant 20% of the value of the production being trade. That was the difference, a big difference in the 2007, 2008. So trade is important, but not only international global trade, intra-regional trade is a huge source of demand that we cannot lose. And today we don't have that. Many regions don't have that. Even Caribbean islands, which are facing a huge shock today because they are dependent on foods, they're net food importers. They also depend on remittances, which are going down, and they are dependent on tourism, which is basically not happening and won't happen in the next year, most of it at least. They don't have interregional trade. Africa, they have the free trade agreement for Africa, the FTC, but they don't have yet a mobility of goods intra-regionally. It's incredible that if I need to import a commodity, it will be cheaper to get it from a different continent than to get it through in the same continent. Central America, another case, is if I want to get beans, I will go to Colombia rather than to go to Guatemala if I am in Honduras. So again, interregional trade is something that we need to increase because it will create a new source of demand and it will allow us to do that. For that, we need not only to focus on the tariffs, but also to focus on non-trade barriers. And NTBs are important, and NTBs are also related to food safety issues. And here's where we need to do and take this as a huge opportunity to accelerate improvement of food safety issues. Africa is trying to pursue with the African Union and trade ministers the Pan-African Food Safety Agency, and we need to support that. We need to work so that the Pan-African Safety Agency is operating so that we can accelerate the interregional trade and other forms of non-tariff barriers. The second element that I think is central to increase resilience is to improve infrastructure. What we have seen in the COVID-19 is that the infrastructure is central. Logistical issues. We were not ready to track real-time logistical issues. Now we are tracking real-time logistical issues. But clearly we need to find a way to accelerate and to improve the networks of infrastructure. That goes from road, airport, shipping infrastructure, up to a situation of storage facilities. If a farmer needs to cope with the time because of a shock and needs to wait to sell to later, he needs to have access to storage facilities. And that goes from dry to cold storage facilities. Africa is not well prepared for that. Even Latin America in many countries is not well prepared for that. So it's something that we need to work very closely to accelerate that process. We are trying to find ways in which we can optimize the location of those facilities, because the idea is not only to have the facility for farmers to be able to cope with the risk, but it's also to be able to allow them to link to financial markets, like, for example, through a modern warehouse receipt system that is completely electronic and is linking farmers to financial system through e-tickets from the warehouse that you can put in a bank, and the bank will allow you to do factoring, basically to get some liquidity in exchange of that food that is in the warehouse system. But inclusive, no? Inclusive means that small farmers and farmer associations will be able to access to that. And information asymmetries can be minimized using ICT technologies. So again, it's another option, and technologies could help on this. ICT could help on this. And that's where we can also increase resilience. Now, what we are expecting to happen first is the commodity that will move closer to cities is vegetables. So vegetables in the world trade map is a commodity that moves the shorter distances today. And what we will be seeing, and we are already seeing, is a move towards production of vegetables closer to big cities or intermediate cities. And the reason is because we can do control environments, which are cost effective, and that will supply cities. And that will be a response to what we observe and what has happened because of COVID-19, which already was happening, but will be accelerated. The second element is that we will see a significant increase in automatization. And that's good, but bad also. Why? Because most of the changes will have to happen in what we call the food processing part. So packaging, services, and transportation. And this was mostly female. So gender bias, it was females doing this work. And now this is going to be automatized, and automatized very fast. And what will happen with that labor force, okay? The velocity in which we are moving to automatization won't allow us to keep the track and to keep the speed to be able to have the labor supply trained for those needs. And that's something that we need to think very carefully, and it's something that we will need to find ways in which we can accelerate the training and building capacity so that the labor supply will match that new labor demand. And the final element is internet and the velocity in which we're going to move into access to e-commerce, for example. But we need to understand that although that will help to shorten distances, it needs 4 conditions. You need to have connectivity, you need to have the platform, you need to have mobile money, which some continents like Africa already has, M-Pesa, for example. And you also need to have the mail system, the transportation system to move the commodity. That's where most of developing countries fail. They could have connectivity, some connectivity, they could have the platform, they could have, in many cases, mobile money, but they don't have the capacity to move goods. So we need to be realistic of what can be feasible and what we can do and what we need to change. But just to finalize, I think this crisis has to be taken as an opportunity. It will be a mistake to keep pushing resources through subsidies to producers and so on without having a productive link to it. If I'm going to do a public works program to reactivate the economy, that public works programs have to be linked to investment in infrastructure that is needed for the productive sectors. If I'm going to subsidize something, it has to be a temporal subsidy that will end into something better, like, for example, storage facilities. It's okay to subsidize them initially, but then there will be an investment that will pay a profit. So we need to be very smart in the way we do this type of if not, we're going to increase distortions and the situation will be even worse. It's another way of putting reducing competitive markets. So again, anything that will help us to increase competitiveness, to increase efficiency, reducing losses and waste, which is central in this process, I think will make us more resilient. And that's what we need to do to live under this world of uncertainty, which is basically an options world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maximo. You've certainly given us a full menu to think about, and it's your message on trade being critical to resilience is very important, including regional trade. And of course, your menu goes much beyond trade, going into infrastructure, ICT, automation, and so on. Randall, let me come to you. For grain shippers and traders, what are the issues that you would flag as needing to be on our radar screens going forward? Can you walk us through the situation in shipping and ports more generally?
Sure. Thanks again. And so generally, when people think about shipping and trading companies, we're most often recognized for the bricks, mortar, and the steel required to move those agricultural commodities around the world. These operations and this infrastructure are critically important assets for the global food system, and they play a key role in moving food safely and efficiently from areas of abundance to areas of deficit. For Cargill, the COVID crisis has reinforced for us and highlighted for us that none of that infrastructure really matters if we don't have the people and the support systems to help us run and manage those assets. And from our vantage, and so it's been a useful lesson that we will take forward. From our vantage point, we've seen minimal disruption of the shipping and ports as we move products around the world. And as that COVID crisis has emerged, we've seen, and more folks have been asked to stay home. Cargill, along with others in the sector, have had to adapt the ways of working to put our people first and to innovate that work to ensure that we can keep our people safe during these times of crisis and effectively staff and our facilities and our operations to keep food moving. How we work has changed forever. And we have seen the acceleration in the digitalization along our agricultural supply chains. We see more remote work and inspection capabilities than we've ever seen. We've seen increased contingency planning and have recognized really just how lucky we are to have a highly capable and resilient workforce inside our company. At one point, 60,000 people, 60,000 Cargill employees were working remotely from home to try to keep our agricultural supply chains moving and serve our customers and our export markets. If I were to look to the future, I would be watching for increased digitalization of that global food system, more attention to food safety systems and performance, an increasingly transparent and resilient supply chain as people prepare for future shocks to the system, and an increased digitalization of the trading documents and the communications that we do every day as part of our business. And so this is how we think about where we're going into the future.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's extraordinary. 60,000 Cargill employees working from home.
No, 60. 60,000,
yes,
on a daily basis. Yes,
indeed. That's an extraordinary number. And of course, thank you for your comment that how we work has changed forever. I think that's very much the case. Saad, I'd like to come to you. What should the G20 put the emphasis on going forward with respect to agriculture? And realistically, do you think the G20 can make any further progress on agriculture between now and the end of the year?
Dua, first, really, I agree with the previous speakers that uncertainty is there. We don't know really what the future holds for all of us with regard to the global pandemic. But in general, the G20 leaders, the G20 ministers of agriculture and also ministers of trade, they committed really, to ensure the sustainable flow of goods and services without any disruption. And this is very important. You know, the good thing, Dua, and the respected audience, that the G20 members are the members of the international organization, most of them, specifically FAO, WFP, IFAD, and OECD as well. They asked really the international marketing, the agricultural international marketing system, which is AMIS. They requested them really, and they supported them, and they requested them to follow up the negative impact of the pandemic and to report directly to the G20 leaders during the final, or the summit will be in November. But with regard to agriculture, the good thing really, Dua, that there is complete consensus about all issues in agriculture, specifically promoting agricultural investment responsibly, reducing food losses and waste, rural development, in addition to the control of pests and diseases. There is 100% consensus in this field. So we really, let me say, we trust that the G20 leaders, and according or based on the ministerial communiques, will be watching and guarding the development with the global pandemic, and they gave clear, let me say, delegation to have very quick action to meet any negative impact.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those comments. Indeed, the G20 has been seen as a stabilizing force during this crisis. So they've been valuable, really, to have those, to have that unified voice, let's say, on the international stage at a time like this. Edwini, let me come to you. What lessons have trade policymakers learned from COVID-19 in the food area? And what should they be focusing on to avert future such crises from spilling over into food?
Thank you very much for this question. I believe that it's still a process, it's still ongoing, just as I think policymakers learned from the 2008 crisis and implemented them. I do believe that policymakers everywhere are also compiling the lessons from this crisis. And I believe that they wouldn't like to waste this crisis by compiling lessons which they can deploy in the near future should we have a similar occurrence. I think in the wake of COVID-19, several coalitions of countries have tabled proposals in the WTO which range from, vowing to keep global agricultural value chains open and not to disrupt what has now become a global process of food production. Undertaking to not to impose food export restrictions and refraining from imposing unjustified barriers to agricultural trade, vowing to exercise restraint in establishing domestic food stocks, and as well to keep food trade policy responses to COVID-19 targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. In fact, these words were echoed on numerous occasions by the G20 and other several WTO members. Overall, I believe most countries have urged over time a careful monitoring of trade policies, which were enacted in the wake of the pandemic, and stressed the need for enhanced transparency. As I had said, as a result of the asymmetry of information, some countries moved to impose export restrictions. But once it became clear that global stocks were plentiful, they moved quickly to unwind those measures that they had put in place. So going forward, I think my boss, Alan Wolf, made a point that we need to move ahead with the agreement on agriculture, the reforms of the agreement on agriculture, which would cover issues such as export restrictions and others. I think all of this would help create a predictable and secure trading environment for agricultural trade to flourish and to be able to confront or meet the challenges the sector faces. Countries basically have to work harder to ensure that we are able to bring the negotiations to conclusion. Already, I think we are looking forward to MC12, where a number of countries are determined to get a respectable outcome, because in the negotiations, we do have 7 broad areas, namely domestic support, market access, export restrictions, export competition, special safeguard mechanism, and obviously cotton. And then obviously public stock holding for food security. Countries are determined to make progress on these issues because they do realize that if we were to conclude the negotiations, then it would actually lead to a level playing field and introduce much more security and predictability to the trading system. I can see that all WTO members are committed to getting, results. As to whether that will be accomplished in MC12 is an open question, but a number of countries have stressed the need for an incremental process, that even if we are not able to get concrete results at MC12, it should be a step in that right direction. So I do believe that countries have learned the lessons, and in as much as we have learned the lessons, this should also be accompanied by focusing on the agricultural negotiations to come up with an outcome in this area, which would help strengthen agricultural trade in general. I think I'll just stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Edwini. So indeed, for greater resilience in future, we need a more resilient agreement on agriculture, and this can only be achieved by making a success of the ongoing WTO negotiations. I'll now start taking questions from viewers, and I know that Maximo, you need to leave us at 3, so I will very quickly direct the first question to you in case you're able to give us your thoughts briefly on this before you jump off the call. 2 questions have come in on the issue of food stocks. You've mentioned that we have sufficient food supply this year, and that in fact food stocks are rising. Viewers are asking, where are these food stocks positioned? Who has them? And is there an equitable distribution of these food stocks?
Okay, that's a pretty complex question. That's part of the role of Agricultural Market Information System, AMIS. They track the existence of stocks. So the AMIS basically have, since the G20 of Paris and reinforced by the last G20, by the current G20 of Saudi Arabia, is basically enforcing their capacities to be able to collect the information at the country level. So AMIS brings together the key exporting countries and the key importing countries of staple commodities, and they have been collecting the information on the stocks. So that's why we have up-to-date information of stocks. Now, if the stocks are distributed evenly around the world or not, that's a complex question. Most of the stocks right now are held in China and in other countries of the world, key big exporting countries, and they are at a significant high levels, which put us in comfort. Why is it important to understand that? Because countries, small countries, to have storage facilities to stock for price stabilization is a mistake. We know that that creates distortions. It's very difficult to implement. It creates significant losses, and countries don't have the capacity to be able to stabilize prices. On the contrary, when we are talking of global stocks, which is basically the aggregate of all the big countries that have stocks, allow us to have a buffer mechanism in which we can facilitate access to food in situations of crisis. In 2007, 2008, the level of stocks were too low, and that was a major problem. We didn't have that buffer. Today, that's not the case. So it doesn't matter where they are. What it matters is how much they are, and that they will be able to move across borders through free trade arrangements. I think that's important, the important thing to think. Understand that we are in a world where the exports of staple commodities are highly concentrated. They depend on 5 or 6 countries. They concentrate most of the exports of staple commodities. Therefore, if that food flows, that's okay. It's better than 2007, 2008, where 3 or 4 countries were concentrated. Now we have more, especially the southern corner of South America, which has increased the capacity of exporting staples. So again, I don't think we need to worry where they are physically are. Okay, I think we need to worry how much they are at a global level, and that we allow commodities to move across borders.
Thank you very much, Maximo. That's a very useful message. More important than the location of the stock is having the stock and having that extra supply. Thank you. Randall, viewers are asking about biofuels. They want a slight expansion of your comments on biofuels. They want to know what specifically is happening to biofuels markets as a result of COVID-19. Is it a simple decline in demand because of a lower demand for everything in the COVID period, or is there something more that's happening?
Yeah, no, I think it really is just a simple relationship here. I mean, personally, I haven't driven my car for over a month. And I think that is likely the case for a vast majority of people, either that are sheltering in place or are working remotely from home, which has been a significant social change that's going on. And we know that biofuel prices are tied to petroleum prices. And so I think it's as simple as that. Where we are going with biofuels, I think that there's a lot of interest in low carbon biofuels, and we're seeing that market, lots of interest in that market, and so we're keeping our eye and attention on how do we address issues of sustainability through some of these low carbon biofuels as well.
Thank you very much. Saad, we have a number of questions for you. So let me at least ask you 2 of these questions combined. The first has to do with viewers asking about Saudi Arabia's food security and Gulf Arab states. This is a region that is highly dependent on food imports, and they would like to know from you how the region has fared during the COVID pandemic. So that's one of the questions that's directed to you. The other question is on the G20 and how it operates. I have a question here asking about the functioning of the G20. The viewer is saying that G20 meetings start immediately with the negotiation of a declaration. Are there other ways to conceive of G20 work? Can there be more policy work, for example, done within the G20?
Thank you, Dua. With regard to the first question, yes, we know really that GCC or the Gulf region countries are considered net food importing countries. Almost 80% of our food is imported. And during the pandemic, really, let me say, take Saudi Arabia as example. We really encouraged the farmers, workers, food business people to continue the production of the local production according to the opportunity cost that we have. For example, poultry, fishery, whatever, and we have opportunity costs to increase the production and to continue having very stable flow of food in the local market. With regard to trade, really, Saudi Arabia imports from everywhere, from the global market. And the good thing really that the government really supported food import by 2 billion Saudi riyal to keep stable supply of food from the global market. So I think really during the global pandemic, the GCC in general and Saudi Arabia specifically did not experience any food shortage at all. With regard to the second question, Dua, you know, the G20 decisions is by total consensus. So the presidency will draft with the Troika and other international organization the main subject, or let me say the hot subject in the world in the beginning, and to study it together, to discuss it together, to negotiate with each other until we reach, let me say, the final draft. Then it comes to the deputies and the ministers, then by the end to go to the leaders. But in general, while we are talking about agriculture and food security, the good thing really that in this year, I call it Initiative of Riyadh, really. All really members agreed about promoting the responsible agricultural investment to meet the high demand for food in the future.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. Thank you very much for those responses. Idwini, there are a couple of questions from Geneva, so from people who know the WTO and who would like to ask you the following. I think it's questions that stem from some of your comments, but also from the introductory comments of Alan Wolf, the Deputy Director General. They'd like to know whether the monitoring function that he spoke about at length in his opening remarks, whether that can be strengthened within the regular Committee on Agriculture in the WTO so as to be brought up to a level where there's less of a need to go to dispute settlement. Is there any thought going into that or asking some of the viewers?
Thanks for that. Already, we do have a review process under the committee, under the Agreement on Agriculture, and countries do actually, pose questions on member state policies. Now, as to whether that can be strengthened, definitely it can be. But as we are a member-driven institution, we need to have very clear guidance from the members. If it is something that the members want to move in that direction and empower the committee to do that, then obviously there's something that we can do. But already within the committee, it is possible for countries to demand information. And if members want that to be strengthened, certainly I can't see why that cannot be done, but very much would depend on the members acting together and entrusting the committee with that. We do have also, not only in the area of agriculture, we do have under the, let's say, for example, the SPS, the TBT, where countries can raise specific trade concerns as well. So once these are resolved in the committee, then it obviates the need for countries to go to dispute settlement. So it saves resources, time, and everything. So in the context, I think the monitoring exercise is good, and I think countries do see the value. And across the board, I think most members would like to see the monitoring system strengthened. As to whether that would devolve in each and every committee, that is something that the members would have to address. But clearly, I think we are moving in that direction where members would like to see enhanced transparency across the board, as they do see that it is one of the fundamental principles underpinning the WTO agreement.
Thank you very much for that. So with this, I'm happy to bring this webinar to a close. I think we've learned an incredible amount of information about the current state of play. This has been very useful and very reassuring, obviously with a very big menu of things to address for the future. Thank you very much to our viewers, and thank you to our outstanding panel. And we will all stay in touch, I hope. Goodbye. Goodbye.